Good morning in this new year of 2023, which is going to be a momentous year by any standards. Momentous in perhaps positive ways, but certainly with a number of looming, serious existential threats. But that's the year that we have to live and make the best use of. Certain words have been bandied about as we led up to this year, and they're very much in cyberspace and in the media at the moment. One of them, which I'll be homing in on in this piece, is de facto, a Latin tag, which those of you who studied Latin at school, like I did very many years ago, have some memory of. Nation, Scotland, independence, court, Supreme Court, general election, democratic processes. Well, many of these things came into play one way or another in a debate in the Holyrood Parliament earlier this week. And I'd like to just let you hear the voice of the presiding officer as she opened the debate and invited Angus Robertson to state the case for the motion.
Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 7429 in the name of Angus Robertson on people's right to choose respecting Scotland's democratic mandate. I would ask those members who wish to speak in the debate, please press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Angus Robertson, Cabinet Secretary, to speak to and move the motion. Up to 11 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Every member here in this chamber is here today because of the trust placed in us by the people of Scotland through their votes. Votes that had consequences, votes that, thanks to our system of proportional representation, mattered and allowed people to express their choices. That, Presiding Officer, is what democracy is about, making people's choices matter. Of course, there is more to modern European democracy than just counting up votes, but when you start to undermine that fundamental, when you seek to deny people what they have voted for, you risk undermining democracy itself. And this places obligations on those of us who win elections. We have to do our best to deliver on the mandates that we are given. But it also obliges us all, when we do not win elections, and very few of us are elected at the first time of asking, to respect the decision of the people, acknowledge the result, and accept the right of the winner to deliver the commitments that they were elected on.
So, very clear statement, and one of the best speeches in all, in fact, I think, that Angus Robertson had ever given. It was a model of clarity. It was concise, it was straight to the point, it was not emotional in any sense, but it was burning with a real, true conviction. What's the situation we've been in? Well, we had a referendum in 2014, a referendum on how Scotland should be governed, with the simple choice, yes to independence or no to a retention of the status quo. In other words, being a part of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom at that time was still defined as a union of nations, not a union of constituencies, not a union of counties of England or Scotland, but a union of nations. England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, in a sense, is a province, but we'll allow them the status of a nation to simplify the argument. We lost that referendum, we being the independence factor, and we lost it, I thought, graciously in the speeches of Alex Salmond and subsequent speeches after Alex's resignation by Nicola Sturgeon when she became leader. And that is, we lost it. We'll now try and work within the system. But at the time Nicola was making that statement, another general election was imminent, the 2015 general election. And at the manifesto launch, Nicola made it clear, and the manifesto made it quite clear, that we accepted the result of the referendum as it stood. But if there was material change, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against its will, after quite explicit promises that if we voted no, we would retain our EU membership, then that would be reconsidered. Or if there was significant evidence that the will of the Scottish people was still and increasingly that they should be an independent nation. Well, what's happened since that? Since then, under Tory governments, the UK has shifted further and further to the right, and the Conservative Party has conducted what could only be described as an attack on some of the fundamentals of democracy, law, equity, and justice. Now, that's a political view. It's my view. It also happens to be the view of the Labour Party, even under the feeble leadership of Keir Starmer. It's certainly the view of a very large number of people. And the crisis in the health service, allied to the way in which the great threat of the pandemic was handled, or specifically mishandled, by that Tory government, a way which included considerable elements which only could be construed as venality. In other words, by some it was used as an opportunity for enrichment and profit. And there's a big scandal there yet to be covered properly. So where are we at? Well, a Scottish political party has the right to treat the decisive outcome of a general election, structured as a de facto referendum, as a mandate to pursue independence and to proceed as they see fit, unilaterally, to enact the people's will by progressive, peaceful actions. That's what elections are about. Elections from the time of the Greeks in city squares in Athens and elsewhere, consulting the people, allowing them to decide how they were to be governed and who was to do the governing, has been to give power to representatives of the people to act on their stated intentions and objectives. And that power is called a mandate. It's made normally by simple majority, 51% of those voting. UK general elections are still on that basis. It's first past the post. Seats are won in constituencies, and a simple majority is required in the House of Commons for the political party that has that majority to govern. In other words, to implement their key policies. Now, nothing in electoral law or electoral practices specifies what a political party has the right to pursue. That's for the political party. And in nations across the world at various times, political parties, while they have to carry on the normal business of government and manage things like education, defence, health services, a whole range of things, they tend to have a central ethos that they're pursuing. And it's been independence in the case of many nations, and there have been independence parties doing that all over the world, some with spectacular success, notably in the Indian subcontinent, and eventually achieving their major objective. So a political party in a UK general election offering candidates on a manifesto that says their single overriding objective is the pursuit of independence has a perfect right to treat the outcome of that election as decisive as Scotland's national democratic will. Now, Nicola and the SNP right up to, including and beyond the 2014 referendum, pursued a policy of gradualism, which they could claim was successful in that it led initially to a referendum, which unfortunately was deemed the gold standard by the SNP, and in the sense that it was perhaps the ideal way to have a referendum, with the approval and the recognition of the government of the United Kingdom that the result of that referendum would be acted on. But there's nothing in any referendum that specifies the automatic outcome will be a change. It simply forces the dominant power, which is facing secession, and let's not avoid that word, it's a reality, it's used as a pejorative by unionists to describe independence, but independence, sovereignty, ultimately involves secession. Now, secession has a unilateralist aspect to it. In other words, it's generally regarded as people pulling out against the will of the major party. So that's the situation. Following that, it was quite clear that the significant changes of Scotland being taken out of the EU against its will and a rising tide again of independence votes pushing it towards several majorities, and the repeated election of SNP, independence committed MPs to Parliament, to the Westminster Parliament, and to the Scottish Parliament, and to government in the Scottish Parliament, reflected that will. Nicola has always tried to pursue legal routes and has always tried to pursue the illusory repeat of the so-called gold standard. She's a lawyer and she thinks in that way, and it certainly is a desirable outcome if it's at all possible. I do not believe, and I think a large number of independence-minded Scots now agree, and certainly all of the unionist parties, whatever they may say and equivocate on, believe that Scotland is never going to be given another referendum, that's never going to be given the right to hold one, and it's never going to be allowed to have independence if England and the Westminster Parliament has anything to do with it. Against that background, Nicola felt that she had to test the right of the Scottish Government to hold a referendum all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, I do not believe, because she's a rational, intelligent woman with a finely honed legal mind, that she ever believed there was a snowball's chance in hell of that being approved. Unionists are now, and a number of ill-conceived comments from within independence supporters and politicians, that somehow Nicola, her hopes were smashed by the Supreme Court ruling. I think she would have been mildly miffed, but she would have expected it. She had to try. She had to try that so that it was perfectly clear that the power structure in UK was denying Scotland what Scotland and Scotland's electorate see as their democratic right, initially to hold a referendum to ascertain the will of the Scottish people. That's been the key objective. Not to wave a magic wand which would cause independence to happen as the result of that referendum, but to determine what the will of the Scottish people is. Now, unfortunately, political parties of all colour are bound to take account of opinion polls. Let's remind ourselves what opinion polls are. Opinion polls are something that emerged in the relatively early part of the last century, in the 20th century. And they used sampling techniques of a small sector of the population or a given population or constituency to determine the will of the people as expressed in answers to simple questions at that time. In other words, a snapshot. Now, these have provided a a useful tool in some sense to political parties. They provide tools to both sides of an argument who both manage to claim that the polls actually support their position. The polls, of course, cost money, and the pollsters are hard-eyed businessmen and women, and they have to get clients, and clients have a view of what they want from the poll in terms of the questions. The best pollsters are highly ethical, but at the end of the day, they are the supplier and somebody is the commissioner and the client, whether it's government or a political party or a political organisation. And polls have a certain tendency to reflect the wishes for the outcome of the commissioner. In other words, the man or the woman who pays the piper may not exactly call the tune, especially if they're dealing with an ethical pollster, but they sure as hell can influence how that tune is performed and experienced. Nobody in their right mind has ever suggested that the democratic process should be determined by opinion polls. And yet exactly that view is being promulgated not only by unionists who would argue it when they see the polls shifting in their direction, but otherwise rational independence supporters. A poll has no place in the democratic process. It's a bellwether. It's a weather vane on the top of a church that gives you an idea of which way the wind is blowing at a point in time. So let's get that straight. Now, Nicola, faced with an apparently completely intractable government in Westminster and an intractable UK, and the Supreme Court doing what it was inevitable they would do, supporting UK law and the Scotland Act, both of which are designed to keep Scotland in subjection as a devolved nation of the UK. That's what that law is there for. And it can be used legitimately in many cases and manipulated in other cases to ensure that happens. So what was Nicola to do here? Well, I can claim, I don't claim to be alone, but I claim to do a hell of a lot of work on it. I've been arguing well since before the 2016 Holyrood elections that we should look on these electoral successes as evidence of support of the electorate for independence. Now, theoretically, a devolved government in power goes to the electorate saying, give us more devolved government and we will do things well or better and change significant things, but within the frame of the United Kingdom and devolution and the Scotland Act and the devolved settlement. But the reality is, the vote of the electorate, if they are voting for an independence party or parties clearly committed to independence, or for unionist parties clearly committed to remaining in the UK, that they are voting for that great overarching position of how Scotland should be constitutionally governed. Now, I would not argue, other than that in previous elections, perhaps leading up to 2021, there had been an element of the SNP or the Green vote which actually liked the day-to-day devolved politics of the SNP and the Greens, but did not want independence and did not expect their casting of that vote and even the election of an SNP government as likely to bring it about. I argued strongly before the 2021 election on Twitter and in blogs that we should make it explicitly clear at that election that if you vote SNP or if you vote Green, you are voting for a party firmly committed to another referendum and to independence. And to some degree they did that, but it was still argued after that vote. Well, they didn't all vote for independence. And people popped up at the prompting of unionist parties saying, I'm a solid, hardcore unionist, but I voted SNP because I liked some of their other policies for devolved government. Well, I don't know how they would know that. I mean, exit polls are the only way you could determine that. So Nicola took this on, I think to the surprise of everybody, and to the surprise and at least transitory delight of me, that she was going to position the next UK general election, scheduled probably for early 2024, or earlier if somehow this appalling Conservative government could be brought down, which has proved a hard task. We've managed to rattle through a few Tory prime ministers whose heads are on the spikes, but we are not any further forward in dumping this appalling, awful, incompetent, right-wing, venal, expedient, short-term Tory government. So let's look back at that word de facto, because this word has been misrepresented and Nicola's word has been misrepresented, and I think frankly there's been extensive confusion in some members of the party. Jim Sillars has allowed a platform at reasonable intervals in the Herald to parade his confusion between all of us, and he does it again in today's Herald, but that's another matter. Well, let me look back at my old Latin. De facto. It means existing in reality, whether or not officially recognised by laws or other formal norms. It's commonly used to refer to what happens in practice, in contrast with de jure, which means by law, referring to things that happen according to official law. Nicola, as a lawyer, I don't believe at any point, and no person with any rational and researched interest into the matter could believe that de facto meant other than we will say this is, unlike opinion polls, a true, valid and democratic sampling of the will of the Scottish people. It will not in itself bring about automatically a referendum or bring about certainly the independence of Scotland, but it can solidly underpin, solid gold underpinning for the fact that the party for whom the Scottish electorate vote in the next UK general election, if their party is committed to independence, that is a mandate for that party to act, and act decisively. Again, I read what I've tweeted several times. A Scottish political party has the right to treat their decisive outcome of a general election, structured as a de facto referendum, as a mandate to pursue independence and to proceed as they see fit, unilaterally, to enact the people's will by progressive, peaceful political actions. How Nicola interprets that mandate, if it's given, and I believe it will be if we get a proper campaign underway, and perhaps heal some of the factions that have appeared within the independence movement, excuse me. So I better cut off at that because I'm beginning to get a tickly cough. Have a good day.